long before the rise of recorded history, before the empires of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley shaped the known world, there may have existed a civilization so advanced, so harmonious with the planet, that its memory has persisted only in myth, legend, and scattered fragments of knowledge. Known as Lemuria, this lost empire is said to have stretched across vast continents now submerged beneath the oceans, a society that mastered not only the material sciences but also the subtle energies of the earth, integrating technology, ethics, and spirituality in ways modern humans are only beginning to glimpse. Tales of sunken cities, sacred temples aligned with stars, and survivors who carried crucial wisdom to distant lands hint at a civilization whose sophistication challenged the limits of imagination, blending astronomical precision, architectural ingenuity, and moral foresight into a cohesive culture that thrived for millennia. Across continents, in stories from India, Polynesia, Africa, and the Americas, echoes of this civilization appear in flood legends, sacred geometry, and advanced construction, suggesting that humanity's earliest steps toward mastery were guided not solely by trial and error, but by a heritage of knowledge and restraint handed down from a world now lost beneath the waves. This is the story of Lemuria, a civilization that existed before the flood, whose legacy continues to ripple through time, offering both wonder and warning to all who seek to understand the origins of human advancement. The memory that refused to drown. Long before humanity learned to preserve its past through writing, it relied on memory shaped into story, repetition turned into survival, and myth used not as fantasy, but as warning. These early narratives were not concerned with precise dates or linear timelines, because they were formed in a world where time itself felt cyclical rather than progressive. Civilizations rose, fell, and vanished long before anyone thought to record them in stone. Among these memories is the persistent idea that humanity once lived in a world far older and far more advanced than the one described in conventional history, a world that did not decline through war or famine, but disappeared beneath overwhelming environmental forces. The name Lemuria would come much later, but the memory of a lost land swallowed by water appears again and again across cultures that should have no shared origin, suggesting not coincidence, but inheritance from a time when humanity was still one story, not many. What makes Lemuria unusual among lost civilizations is how quietly it enters the historical conversation. Unlike Atlantis, which arrives through a known philosopher and a defined narrative, Lemuria first appeared as a scientific hypothesis in the 19th century, proposed to explain biological mysteries that conventional geography could not. Scientists noticed that certain species, particularly lemurs, existed in regions separated by vast oceans with no plausible migration route. To account for this, they proposed a massive land bridge, once connecting Madagascar, India, and parts of Southeast Asia. Though later dismissed by plate tectonics, the hypothesis left behind a name that would take on a far deeper meaning once researchers began noticing how closely ancient traditions aligned with the idea of a sunken southern continent. In ancient Tamil literature, preserved for thousands of years through oral and written tradition, there are repeated references to a vast southern land known as Kumari Kandam. This was not described as a mythic paradise or symbolic realm, but as a real place governed by kings, scholars, and councils that predated known empires. These texts describe organized systems of education, literature, and law existing long before the earliest accepted civilizations. Most striking is the way these writings describe the land's destruction, not as a single flood, but as successive losses to rising seas, each wave consuming more territory and forcing survivors to migrate northward. The tone is not poetic or exaggerated, but mournful and precise, as if recounting a national trauma rather than a legend. Similar memories surface far beyond South Asia. Polynesian oral traditions speak of ancestral homelands lost beneath the ocean, described not as scattered islands, but as a continuous landmass that once supported entire populations. These stories frame ocean voyaging not as adventurous exploration, but as forced migration following catastrophic loss. The navigational precision preserved in Polynesian cultures, knowledge of stars, currents, and winds, appears suddenly and fully formed, with no clear developmental stage. This raises an uncomfortable question. Where did such advanced maritime knowledge originate, and why does it appear to be inherited rather than invented? In Southeast Asia, ancient temples and cosmological diagrams depict cycles of creation and destruction, worlds rising and sinking in endless repetition. These ideas appear embedded into the foundational belief systems of cultures that officially emerged much later, suggesting that their cosmology was inherited rather than observed firsthand. Even in regions far removed from the Indian Ocean, flood myths describe not gentle inundation but violent planetary upheaval, where land collapses, seas surge upward, and humanity is nearly erased. The consistency of these accounts across continents hints at a shared ancestral memory, fractured by time but rooted in the same catastrophic era. What challenges modern understanding is not whether these stories are literally true in every detail, but why they persist so stubbornly. Civilizations tend to glorify victories, founders, and golden ages, yet these stories center on loss so complete that it reshaped human existence. Lemuria, whatever it was, appears to represent a point of origin that humanity does not celebrate, but mourn. This suggests it was not merely another kingdom, but something foundational, whose destruction forced humanity into a long period of rebuilding and forgetting. Geology adds another layer of discomfort. Beneath the Indian Ocean lie massive submerged plateaus that show evidence of having once been closer to sea level. While mainstream science attributes their submergence to slow tectonic processes, there is growing acknowledgement that Earth's history includes periods of sudden instability. Rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age flooded vast coastal regions worldwide, erasing entire landscapes now buried beneath continental shelves. If advanced societies existed along these coastlines, their physical traces would be among the hardest to detect. Rather than asking whether Lemuria can be neatly proven, a more revealing question emerges. Why does humanity remember a drowned world at all? Civilizations separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years tell variations of the same story, a time before the flood, a great loss, and a fractured rebirth. Lemuria may not simply be a place, but a memory of humanity's first collapse, a reminder that advancement does not guarantee survival, and that the planet itself has erased worlds before without hesitation. This is where the story of Lemuria truly begins, not as myth, not as fantasy, but as a shadow stretching across human history, asking whether our understanding of the past has been shaped not by what survived, but by what was lost beneath the water. A world already complete. When ancient sources speak of Lemuria, they do not describe a society struggling toward organization or experimenting with survival. Instead, they depict a world that appears already complete, as if it emerged fully formed rather than gradually assembled. This detail is critical because it challenges the modern assumption that civilization must always begin in simplicity and progress toward complexity. Lemuria is remembered not as humanity's first attempt, but as something closer to a culmination, an advanced state that existed before the rules of recorded history were ever written. Its people are portrayed as inheritors of deep planetary knowledge, living within systems refined over countless generations, long before later cultures learned to stack stones or carve calendars. Accounts of Lemurian society consistently emphasize stability rather than expansion. Unlike later empires driven by territorial conquest or resource accumulation, Lemuria appears to have existed in equilibrium with its environment. Population growth was controlled, land use was deliberate, and settlement patterns followed natural geography rather than overriding it. Cities were described as integrated into landscapes rather than imposed upon them, positioned according to terrain, water flow, and energetic balance. This suggests a civilization that understood the long-term consequences of environmental disruption and chose restraint over dominance. Leadership in Lemuria, according to surviving traditions, was not centralized around absolute rulers or dynastic bloodlines. Authority flowed from knowledge rather than force, with councils of elders, scholars, or specialized caretakers guiding societal decisions. These leaders were responsible not only for governance, but for maintaining balance between human activity and planetary systems. Power was viewed as a responsibility rather than a privilege, and misuse of it was considered a threat to collective survival rather than a personal failure. Education formed the backbone of Lemurian culture. Learning was not confined to elite classes or specialized institutions, but embedded into daily life from early childhood. Individuals were taught to observe natural cycles, understand celestial movement, and recognize patterns linking the sky, land, and sea. Mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and environmental science were not treated as separate disciplines, but as interconnected expressions of the same underlying reality. This holistic approach allowed Lemurian society to function with remarkable cohesion, as individuals understood not only how systems worked, but why balance mattered. The people themselves are often described as physically and psychologically distinct from modern humans. Some traditions speak of longer lifespans, enhanced sensory perception, and a heightened awareness of emotional and environmental changes. These traits are sometimes dismissed as mythological exaggeration, but they may represent adaptations to a world with different environmental conditions. Lower atmospheric density, stronger geomagnetic stability, or different climatic patterns could have shaped human development in ways that no longer apply today. Technology in Lemuria was not driven by speed, output, or efficiency as modern systems are. Instead, it focused on sustainability and integration. Tools and infrastructure were designed to function in harmony with natural forces, minimizing waste and disruption. This approach allowed Lemurian society to operate at an advanced level without leaving behind the environmental scars that marked later civilizations. Their technology did not dominate nature, it cooperated with it. Trade and communication networks suggest Lemuria was not isolated, but deeply connected to other regions of the ancient world. Maritime routes extended across vast distances, facilitated by advanced navigation techniques based on stellar observation and oceanic understanding. These routes enabled the exchange of ideas, agricultural knowledge, and cultural practices long before conventional history acknowledges global contact. Rather than exporting dominance, Lemuria appears to have shared knowledge, seeding future civilizations across the planet. Despite its stability, Lemurian society was not static. Innovation existed, but it was guided by ethical limits and long-term assessment. Changes were introduced cautiously, tested across generations rather than rapidly deployed. This slow evolution may explain why Lemuria endured for so long, but it may also have contributed to its vulnerability. A civilization optimized for equilibrium may not adapt quickly enough to sudden planetary upheaval. If Lemuria truly existed as described, it represents a form of advancement fundamentally different from modern definitions. Its success was measured not by growth or control, but by continuity and balance. The tragedy of its loss lies not only in the disappearance of a landmass, but in the erasure of a model for civilization that prioritized planetary stability over human ambition. What followed would be worlds built on fragments of this knowledge, struggling to replicate its achievements without fully understanding the principles that sustained them. The planet turns against its keepers. The destruction of Lemuria is remembered not as a single moment, but as a sequence of escalating failures in the planet's stability, unfolding faster than any civilization could adapt. Ancient accounts describe subtle warnings long before the seas arrived. Changes in wind behavior, irregular tides, unfamiliar animal migrations, and deep vibrations felt through the ground itself. These were not isolated omens, but interconnected signals that the Earth's internal systems were shifting. For a society attuned to natural rhythms, such disturbances would have been unmistakable signs that equilibrium was breaking down at a fundamental level. Unlike later flood stories that focus solely on rainfall, Lemurian narratives emphasize movement from below. The land itself is said to have fractured, tilted, and sunk, allowing ocean water to surge inland with overwhelming force. Modern geology recognizes that large sections of the Earth's crust can drop rapidly during tectonic reorganization, especially along complex plate boundaries like those beneath the Indian Ocean. If Lemuria sat atop such a region, even a minor shift could have triggered massive subsidence, instantly converting habitable land into ocean floor. Climate instability likely compounded the crisis. At the end of the last ice age, melting glaciers released enormous volumes of water into the oceans in short bursts, causing sea levels to rise far more rapidly than previously assumed. Coastal regions around the world were drowned within generations, not millennia. For Lemuria, which appears to have been heavily coastal due to its integration with marine systems, this rise would have cut off cities, ports, and agricultural zones almost simultaneously, fracturing the civilization from its edges inward. Seismic activity during this period may have been relentless. Earthquakes would have destabilized infrastructure, damaged energy-regulating structures, and disrupted water systems that Lemuria relied upon for balance. Tsunami waves, triggered by underwater landslides or volcanic events, could have surged across low-lying regions with little warning. Such waves would not only destroy settlements, but contaminate freshwater sources with salt, making recovery increasingly difficult even in areas not permanently submerged. As the collapse accelerated, Lemurian leadership likely faced impossible decisions. Evacuation of entire populations requires time, coordination, and resources that even advanced civilizations struggle to mobilize. Ancient accounts suggest that some regions were abandoned deliberately, while others were lost too quickly for organized retreat. This uneven collapse may explain why memories of Lemuria vary so widely across cultures. Some preserved detailed knowledge, while others retained only the trauma of sudden loss. The psychological impact of watching a stable world disintegrate cannot be understated. Lemurian society, built on the assumption of balance and predictability, would have been forced to confront a reality in which nature itself became hostile. Belief systems grounded in harmony may have fractured under the weight of ongoing catastrophe, creating internal divisions at the worst possible moment. Fear, denial, and conflicting interpretations of the crisis could have undermined collective response efforts. As waters continued to rise, infrastructure designed for stability became a liability. Energy-amplifying structures may have destabilized rather than protected, turning once beneficial systems into sources of environmental stress. Agricultural terraces, water channels, and transportation networks would have failed as land shifted beneath them. The interconnectedness that once made Lemuria efficient now accelerated its collapse, as failure in one region cascaded across the entire system. Survivors describe the final stages of Lemuria not as an explosion or singular event, but as a slow drowning punctuated by moments of sudden destruction. Entire districts vanished overnight, while others lingered in a state of partial submergence, gradually abandoned as conditions worsened. The land did not disappear cleanly, it broke apart, leaving behind scattered islands, reefs, and submerged plateaus that still haunt modern maps of the Indian Ocean. By the time the waters stabilized, Lemuria was no longer a civilization, but a memory carried by displaced populations scattered across the world. What remained beneath the sea were not just buildings and roads, but a way of life that had taken countless generations to refine. The planet had not destroyed Lemuria out of malice, but through indifferent natural processes that care little for human achievement. This realization would echo through survivor cultures, shaping their myths, fears, and worldviews for thousands of years. Scattering of a forgotten people. When the waters finally claimed what remained of Lemuria, humanity did not begin again from nothing. Instead, it continued in fragments carried by survivors who had escaped a dying world with little more than memory, discipline, and pieces of a once coherent system of knowledge. These people did not see themselves as founders of new civilizations. They saw themselves as custodians of something already lost. Their migrations were acts of preservation rather than ambition, shaped by the urgency to keep essential knowledge alive in a world that no longer supported the conditions under which that knowledge had originally flourished. The routes taken by Lemurian survivors appear deliberate rather than random. Oral traditions suggest they followed pathways known long before the catastrophe. Ocean currents, island chains, and seasonal wind patterns mapped through generations of observation. These were not desperate drifts across open water, but controlled journeys guided by astronomical alignment and environmental awareness. Such precision implies that global navigation did not originate after the flood, but survived it, carried forward by people who had once treated the oceans as connective tissue rather than barriers. As these groups reached new lands, they encountered environments that demanded immediate adaptation. Fertile river valleys, dense jungles, deserts, and mountainous regions replaced the balanced landscapes of their submerged homeland. In response, Lemurian knowledge underwent compression. Complex systems that once relied on large-scale infrastructure were reduced to principles, symbols, and teaching stories that could be passed orally. What had once been practical science became encoded wisdom, not because it was mystical, but because the tools to demonstrate it no longer existed. This process helps explain one of the most enduring mysteries in ancient history: the sudden emergence of advanced civilizations without clear developmental stages. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and parts of Southeast Asia, societies appear abruptly with writing systems, astronomical calendars, architectural precision, and organized governance already established. Rather than inventing these systems independently, these cultures may have inherited diluted versions of Lemurian frameworks, adapted to local conditions, and gradually misunderstood over time. Many ancient cultures describe civilizing figures who arrived after a great flood, emerging from the sea or distant lands to teach agriculture, law, astronomy, and construction. These figures are often portrayed as semi-divine, not because they possessed supernatural abilities, but because their knowledge seemed impossible within the context of post-collapse societies. Over generations, the human origins of these teachers faded, replaced by mythology that elevated memory into divinity. Architectural fingerprints left by Lemurian survivors may still be visible today. Early monumental structures across the world share striking similarities in orientation, proportion, and symbolic design. Alignments with solstices, equinoxes, and stellar movements appear even in cultures officially separated by vast distances. This suggests a shared ancestral blueprint for construction, rooted in an understanding of cosmic cycles rather than purely functional shelter. Language and symbolism also carry traces of this shared origin. Repeating motifs, sacred mountains, world trees, serpent imagery, cycles of destruction and rebirth appear across continents with remarkable consistency. These symbols may not be coincidental metaphors, but compressed records of planetary events experienced collectively by a civilization that no longer existed to explain them directly. Myth became a storage system for data too complex to maintain in technical form. Over time, however, the descendants of Lemurian survivors drifted further from their origins. Population growth, resource scarcity, and environmental stress pushed societies toward hierarchy, competition, and territorial control. Knowledge, once shared communally, became restricted, guarded by elites or priestly classes. This shift altered the purpose of inherited wisdom, transforming it from a tool for balance into a mechanism of power. As ethical frameworks eroded, civilizations began applying fragments of Lemurian knowledge without understanding the systems that once governed its use. This imbalance may explain why so many ancient societies experienced sudden collapse despite advanced capabilities. They possessed techniques without context, methods without restraint, and memory without comprehension. The scattering of Lemuria's people ensured that its legacy would survive, but only in pieces. No single culture retained the full picture, and no civilization rebuilt what was lost. Humanity moved forward not as heirs to a complete inheritance, but as descendants piecing together a shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting part of a forgotten world that once stood whole before the sea reclaimed it. The science that disappeared, the technology of Lemuria, as preserved in fragments of oral tradition and later myth, challenges the way we conceive of ancient advancement. Unlike modern societies, whose tools are externalized through machines, combustion, or large-scale chemical processes, Lemurian systems appear to have been deeply integrated with the natural rhythms of the planet. Stone, water, wind, and sound were not merely resources, they were active participants in the function of cities, structures, and instruments. Temples and dwellings were designed to resonate with subtle vibrational forces, amplifying the energy of the land rather than obstructing it, and creating environments that enhanced health, cognition, and communal harmony. To later civilizations, these effects would have seemed miraculous, inexplicable, and inevitably sacred, as the knowledge of underlying principles was lost almost as quickly as the land itself. Ancient accounts describe Lemurian stonework as unlike anything that came before or after. Massive blocks were shaped and fitted with precision that modern machinery would envy, yet without reliance on levers, pulleys, or cranes as we understand them. Some traditions claim that vibrational tuning, applied with sound or resonance, allowed stones to be moved with minimal force. While modern science has only begun to explore acoustic levitation and resonance-based manipulation of matter, these descriptions suggest a civilization that understood energy as an active force capable of reshaping the physical world. The sheer scale and accuracy of this stonework may explain why so many megalithic constructions across distant continents appear simultaneously advanced, as if inheriting principles from a common, lost source. Energy itself was considered a living flow within Lemurian society, not a commodity to be harvested or exploited. Water currents, magnetic fields, and atmospheric electricity were perceived as interdependent systems, each influencing the others. Cities were positioned along natural energy nodes, carefully aligned with geomagnetic patterns and ley lines that the Lemurians appear to have mapped in intricate detail. Structures were not randomly sited, they were tuned to the planet's vibrational network, allowing the people to channel, amplify, and regulate energy for agricultural, architectural, and even communicative purposes. What modern observers might call supernatural was to the Lemurians simply applied knowledge of the subtle forces governing the planet. Crystals and specific minerals played a fundamental role in this understanding. Quartz, magnetite, and volcanic stones were integrated into architecture and tools for their capacity to store, conduct, and modulate energy. This practice extended to everyday life, influencing building materials, agricultural planning, and even medical or healing practices. In oral tradition, These practices were described in symbolic language that would later confuse scholars and mystics alike, presenting science as ritual, vibration as magic, and precision engineering as sacred art. The misinterpretation of this knowledge is one reason why fragments of Lemurian technology were both feared and revered by post-flood societies. Trade and knowledge exchange in Lemuria also relied on these subtle technologies. Maritime navigation, previously described as miraculous in Polynesian and Indian Ocean traditions, may have depended on an intuitive understanding of currents, tides, and geomagnetic forces. Navigation was not limited to coastal sightlines or simple stars. It incorporated the rhythmic pulse of the planet itself. This allowed Lemurian voyagers to maintain precise routes across thousands of miles, preserving cultural connections and distributing knowledge to regions that would later house the first great civilizations. Over time, however, the sudden loss of land and dispersal of population stripped these technologies of context. Survivors carried fragments of Lemurian understanding into foreign lands, but without the supportive infrastructure, the principles often failed to function as intended. Temples, acoustic devices, and water-regulating systems became symbolic relics. Their function was encoded in ritual rather than demonstration. What had once been practical science became mythologized as divine power, leaving later cultures with tools they could not fully understand but could revere and adapt in limited ways. This misalignment also helps explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated architecture and engineering across disconnected regions. In South America, South Asia, and the Middle East, structures demonstrate precise alignment with celestial events, advanced geometry, and unexpected mechanical ingenuity. These creations appear abruptly in history, with no observable developmental stages. Rather than independent invention, they may represent inherited Lemurian principles that survived only in partial, contextless form, adapted to local materials and cosmologies. Even knowledge of energy beyond the visible spectrum appears to have been part of Lemurian life. Some oral traditions speak of tools or chambers that amplified thought, perception, or communication through vibration and resonance. While these claims border on what modern science might consider pseudoscientific, they reflect a coherent worldview in which technology, environment, and consciousness were inseparable. The disappearance of this knowledge left humanity with the remnants of a system so advanced that subsequent civilizations could only imitate its outputs without understanding its mechanisms. The story of Lemurian technology is one of lost integration. It was not merely a set of tools, but a philosophy of harmony, ethics, and planetary alignment encoded into every stone, every building, every city. The flood did not just erase physical structures, it severed humanity's connection to a way of thinking that treated energy, matter, and consciousness as interlinked forces. What remained was a world rebuilding itself from fragments, compelled to reinterpret wisdom as myth and innovation as inspiration, setting the stage for human history to evolve under shadows of what had been possible. Knowledge and restraint in a lost civilization. Lemuria, according to surviving tradition, was not a civilization obsessed with expansion or domination, but one profoundly aware of limits both natural and moral. Its people are described as understanding the delicate balance between power and consequence, possessing knowledge of forces that, if misused, could devastate both society and the environment. Where later empires pursued tools for conquest or industrial extraction, Lemurian systems were developed to harmonize with the planet's energy flows, relying on resonance, vibration, and subtle manipulation rather than brute force. This awareness created a form of technological restraint that, while preserving stability for centuries, also required extraordinary discipline, foresight, and ethical commitment, traits that modern societies often struggle to cultivate even today. The ethical framework underpinning Lemurian science appears inseparable from its practical applications. Stone and crystal were not merely functional materials, they were conduits for energy and understanding, and misuse of these tools was said to produce consequences as immediate as they were catastrophic. For example, temples designed to channel geomagnetic or vibrational forces could amplify harmony in a stable environment, but if altered improperly, they might generate destructive interference, collapsing walls, destabilizing agricultural terraces, or even disrupting human cognition in nearby settlements. This delicate balance required constant observation, teaching, and collective responsibility, creating a culture in which technical mastery could not exist without ethical grounding. Leadership in Lemuria was closely tied to this ethical understanding. Governing councils were not composed solely of those with political acumen, but of those who demonstrated profound comprehension of energy systems, environmental cycles, and communal welfare. These councils maintained regulations that limited certain applications of technology, not to suppress innovation, but to prevent misuse that could propagate disaster. Such restrictions may have appeared draconian to outsiders, but they were essential to sustaining a civilization whose survival depended upon harmony with natural forces rather than domination over them. Education reinforced this ethic from a young age. Children were taught the consequences of imbalance before they were taught construction, agriculture, or mathematics. They learned to observe subtle environmental changes, understand the ethical implications of their actions on communal systems, and develop a moral compass tied directly to the planet itself. Knowledge and ethics were inseparable. Mastery of one without the other was considered dangerous, potentially destabilizing not just the individual, but entire settlements. This principle ensured that Lemurian society remained careful and self-limiting, valuing preservation over rapid advancement. Paradoxically, the very restraint that enabled Lemuria's longevity may have contributed to its vulnerability. While later civilizations adapted aggressively to environmental change, Lemuria relied on the predictability of natural systems. When the planetary equilibrium shifted rapidly due to tectonic instability, rising seas, and climate disruptions, the culture's methods for preservation could not respond fast enough. Their understanding, though profound, was calibrated to balance, not chaos, and the flood demonstrated the limits of even the most disciplined restraint when faced with global upheaval. Some traditions suggest Lemurian knowledge was deliberately compartmentalized to minimize risk. Certain technologies, particularly those capable of altering energy flows on large scales, were accessible only to small, highly trained groups. Sacred texts, instruments, and construction techniques were guarded by councils and transmitted orally in coded forms. This restriction ensured that no single individual could wield enough power to destabilize society, creating a culture of shared responsibility, but also of deliberate secrecy. When Lemuria fell, these protective measures may have ensured survival of knowledge in fragments rather than complete annihilation, but also prevented broader understanding that might have enabled coordinated adaptation during the final crisis. The philosophy of restraint extended to expansion as well. Unlike later empires that sought to dominate neighboring lands, Lemuria maintained a careful relationship with its environment, population, and distant neighbors. Maritime routes and trade networks were guided by ethical principles, ensuring resources were shared, not exploited, and that distant regions were connected without imposing unsustainable burdens. The civilization's survival was predicated not on conquest, but on equilibrium, making Lemuria a model of sustainability that would remain unmatched for millennia. This combination of ethical discipline, technical mastery, and environmental integration may explain why fragments of Lemurian culture were so enduring even after the flood. Survivors carried knowledge that, while incomplete, reflected the principles of balance, observation, and restraint. These principles would echo in the codified laws, cosmologies, and ritual practices of later civilizations, though often stripped of the context that had originally given them power. What remained was the shadow of wisdom, inspiring awe and fear in equal measure, but largely divorced from the systems that once sustained an entire civilization. Lemuria's approach suggests that the true measure of advancement was not speed, scale, or dominance, but the capacity to wield knowledge responsibly over generations. Its loss reminds humanity that mastery without ethics is precarious, and that survival depends as much on restraint as it does on innovation. The civilization that vanished beneath the ocean left a silent warning that intelligence untethered from responsibility can flourish only briefly, and that the planet itself is the final arbiter of sustainability. The ethical sophistication of Lemuria transforms how we interpret its remnants. Where modern observers see ruins, symbols, or mythic exaggerations, they may actually be glimpses of a civilization that understood limits in ways far beyond contemporary comprehension. Its technologies, social structures, and environmental integration were designed to preserve life on a planetary scale. But even the most perfect systems are vulnerable to forces beyond human control. The story of Lemuria's restraint is therefore not just a tale of loss, but a meditation on the fragile intersection of knowledge, power, and morality, and on the challenge of maintaining that balance when the world itself begins to turn against you. Echoes across the world. Even after Lemuria was swallowed by the rising seas, its influence did not vanish entirely. The survivors carried not only fragments of technology and knowledge, but also deep spiritual and cultural practices that shaped the foundations of emerging civilizations. These practices were codified into rituals, ceremonies, and oral traditions that endured for generations, long after the memory of the land itself had faded. In this way, Lemuria became less a place on a map and more a psychological and cultural presence, a framework for understanding human existence, natural cycles, and the consequences of imbalance. Stories of a lost homeland, catastrophic floods, and enlightened teachers appear in civilizations as distant as Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, Southeast Asia, and Polynesia, suggesting a shared heritage encoded not in written history, but in collective memory. The spiritual legacy of Lemuria seems inseparable from its technological knowledge. Unlike later civilizations that separated material science from religious practice, Lemurian culture appears to have blended the two into a single worldview in which ethics, cosmology, and mechanics were intertwined. Temples, altars, and ceremonial sites were constructed with precise astronomical and geomantic alignment, demonstrating that ritual was not mere symbolism, but a method for harmonizing with the planet's energy systems. Priests and scholars served as both spiritual guides and technical experts, mediating between humans and natural forces in ways that modern observers would struggle to classify as either science or religion. This integration of spirituality and practical knowledge ensured that cultural teachings reinforced responsible stewardship, a principle that would resonate through the myths and laws of subsequent civilizations. Many flood myths across the world contain strikingly similar motifs, often describing survivors guided by wise or semi-divine figures who preserved essential knowledge while the rest of the world was consumed. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh recounts Utnapishtim's survival through divine guidance, while Hindu texts speak of Manu and the Great Deluge. Polynesian stories tell of ancestors escaping a submerged homeland, traveling to new islands with celestial knowledge intact. These narratives share more than a thematic resemblance. They suggest that the memory of Lemuria's collapse was carried in oral traditions, abstracted and reframed over generations to make sense of a world that had lost its most advanced civilization. The consistency across continents points not to coincidence, but to a shared historical trauma preserved through cultural encoding. Art and symbolism also reflect Lemuria's lingering influence. Motifs of serpents, spirals, sacred mountains, and cyclical patterns recur in geographically distant cultures, often linked with cosmological or temporal cycles. These symbols may have originated as abstract representations of energy flows, planetary alignment, and environmental cycles known intimately to the Lemurians. As these concepts were transmitted orally, the technical meanings were obscured, leaving later generations with images whose significance felt mystical rather than scientific. The recurrence of these motifs suggests that culture itself became a repository for lost knowledge, a way of preserving the framework of a civilization that no longer existed. Language may have played a similar role in preserving Lemurian memory. Specific numerical systems, calendrical structures, and symbolic terms appear across disconnected civilizations with remarkable consistency. Certain words, gestures, or mythic structures may have been mnemonic devices, encoding knowledge of environmental cycles, celestial movements, and societal ethics. Over generations, these devices were adapted to local dialects and cosmologies, preserving fragments of understanding in forms that appeared mythological rather than literal. In this sense, culture became the medium through which Lemurian knowledge survived, scattered like seeds across the planet. Even architecture shows enduring traces of Lemurian influence. Megalithic sites in South America, Asia, and the Middle East demonstrate alignment with solstices, equinoxes, and distant stars, suggesting inherited astronomical knowledge. The precision and uniformity of these constructions, often appearing centuries before any documented developmental phase in local civilizations, point to the transmission of a sophisticated understanding from a vanished source. Unlike modern archaeological models, which often treat these achievements as isolated brilliance, Lemurian influence implies a shared conceptual origin, dispersed through survivors who preserved fragments of knowledge while adapting to new environments. The ethical dimension of Lemuria's cultural legacy also persisted. Rituals were designed not merely for ceremony, but to instill principles of balance, stewardship, and respect for natural forces. These teachings emphasized the consequences of hubris, the need for harmony with the environment, and the dangers of misusing knowledge. As Lemurian survivors integrated into new societies, these principles were reframed as morality, law, and tradition, influencing early governance, religious practice, and community structure. Even where the specific technological knowledge was lost, the ethical framework survived, shaping human behavior and cultural development for millennia. Over time, the memory of Lemuria evolved into legend, myth, and symbol. Its physical form disappeared beneath the waves, but its imprint remained on human consciousness, guiding civilizations long after the original land was gone. The scattered survivors became the conduits through which wisdom, skill, and cultural patterns were transmitted, ensuring that the knowledge of a world that had mastered harmony with nature would not be forgotten entirely. What survived was not the empire itself, but the ideas, values, and fragments of understanding that would continue to resonate across time and geography, forming the invisible threads linking humanity to a lost golden age. Lemuria's spiritual and cultural legacy reminds us that knowledge and civilization are more than their material remains. They endure through memory, ethics, and shared experience, even when their foundations vanish beneath the waves. The echoes of a sunken world persist in myth, ritual, art, and architecture, challenging us to recognize that humanity's earliest and most advanced civilizations may not exist in the historical record, but in the stories and practices that have survived, quietly shaping the development of our species for thousands of years. Traces of a lost knowledge, even after the floodwaters of Lemuria receded, leaving only fragments of land and memory, its influence was carried forward in ways that would shape emerging civilizations in subtle but profound ways. Scholars and archaeologists have long struggled to explain how complex knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and navigation appeared abruptly in distant cultures with no clear evolutionary pathway. What if the answer lay not in independent invention, but in the deliberate preservation of Lemurian teachings by survivors who spread across the planet, carrying knowledge adapted to local environments, climates, and materials, yet still echoing principles that had once unified an entire civilization? This hypothesis reframes the rise of early empires as a second-hand inheritance, where the essence of Lemuria survived in seeds rather than structures, in rules rather than machines, and in memory rather than monuments. In Mesopotamia, the sudden sophistication of city-states such as Uruk and Ur may reflect this transmission. These societies emerged with advanced urban planning, irrigation systems, and written language fully operational, without evidence of long experimental phases typical of developmental growth. Archaeological records show alignment of ziggurats and public structures with celestial bodies, suggesting that knowledge of astronomy and seasonal cycles was already embedded. Oral traditions of teachers arriving from distant lands or divine messengers could be reframed as cultural memory of Lemurian survivors, instructing local populations in the principles of governance, agriculture, and sacred knowledge, transformed over generations into myths and ritualized practice. Similarly, in Egypt, the precision of early pyramid construction, sophisticated calendar systems, and mathematical exactness points to an inheritance that goes beyond local experimentation. Lemurian survivors arriving in the Nile Valley may have integrated their understanding of planetary cycles and stone manipulation into Egyptian society, encoding advanced methods in symbolic forms, rituals, hieroglyphs, and ceremonial architecture. Temples aligned with stars or solstices and carefully calculated proportions in monumental structures may reflect these remnants, demonstrating a continuity of knowledge filtered through ethical and cultural lenses. Even without full comprehension, later civilizations retained the results, preserving function while transforming form into myth. In South Asia, legends of Kumari Kandam suggest direct continuity. Survivors from submerged lands may have seeded the earliest Tamil and Dravidian civilizations with agricultural techniques, celestial knowledge, and linguistic structures. Cultural motifs, flood narratives, and ritual practices echo the memory of a world lost beneath the sea, subtly encoded in law, tradition, and sacred architecture. This transmission was not merely technical, it was ethical, emphasizing restraint, balance, and harmonious living. These principles were carried forward even as physical infrastructure disappeared, shaping societal priorities and governance in ways that endured for millennia. Across the Pacific, Polynesian navigation techniques, remarkable in their precision and consistency, demonstrate an inherited understanding of currents, wind patterns, and star charts. Survivors of a sunken homeland may have introduced these concepts as mnemonic systems, oral maps, and cultural rituals, preserving sophisticated methods of open ocean navigation. The astonishing accuracy with which Polynesians reach scattered islands may reflect a living memory of Lemuria's maritime knowledge, adapted to a radically different environment, yet still rooted in the original principles of planetary observation and energetic awareness. Megalithic sites, scattered across the globe, from South America to Southeast Asia, also bear silent witness to Lemurian influence. Stonework that defies conventional explanation, massive blocks fitted with precision and aligned with astronomical events, appears suddenly in regions without precedent for such construction. Survivors may have passed on core architectural principles, teaching not merely techniques, but concepts of proportion, resonance, and energy alignment. In this sense, monuments were not only practical constructions but educational tools, preserving a science that could no longer survive in its full technological context. Even subtle aspects of cultural practice, such as ritual geometry, sacred dances, or ceremonial music, may reflect remnants of Lemurian scientific and spiritual systems. Temples were often arranged to create harmonic resonance. Festivals coincided with celestial events, and music or chant could manipulate the perception of space and energy. While later observers interpreted these as religious or mystical, they may have originally functioned as practical applications of sophisticated energy-based science, compressed into forms accessible to the survivors and their new societies. The ethical framework of Lemuria persisted alongside these technical legacies. Knowledge was shared selectively, guided by principles that emphasized responsibility, balance, and restraint. As survivors integrated into new civilizations, these ethical dimensions became embedded in law codes, social hierarchies, and religious doctrines. Even as technical precision faded, the underlying philosophy endured, shaping early governance and cultural norms in ways that facilitated societal stability despite the loss of complete technological understanding. Over time, however, as civilizations expanded and environmental pressures intensified, the direct understanding of Lemurian systems was diluted further. Knowledge became ritualized, partially forgotten, or misinterpreted. Techniques that once functioned as practical tools were transformed into sacred ceremonies, myths, or moral allegories. What survived was both a shadow of the original science and a blueprint for human adaptation, reminding later societies that advancement is not merely a matter of invention, but of ethical application, balance, and preservation across generations. The traces of Lemuria in emerging civilizations suggest that human history is not a clean linear progression, but a palimpsest of inherited knowledge, reshaped through disaster, migration, and cultural reinterpretation. From monumental architecture to navigation, agricultural systems to social ethics, the scattered survivors of a sunken world appear to have seeded humanity with fragments of a civilization far older and more advanced than conventional history acknowledges. These remnants, scattered across the globe, offer tantalizing hints of a knowledge system that transcended geography, endured catastrophe, and quietly molded the foundations of human progress long before recorded history began. Relics of a sunken empire. Even thousands of years after the disappearance of Lemuria, remnants of its civilization appear to surface sporadically across the globe, often in ways that confound conventional explanation. Archaeologists and historians have discovered megalithic constructions, artifacts, and inscriptions that suggest knowledge far beyond what should have existed in early societies. In South America, massive stone blocks in Peru fit together with precision so tight that even modern machinery struggles to replicate the joins without mortar. In India, monolithic temples and underground chambers reflect an understanding of energy distribution and vibration that hints at principles of resonance now only beginning to be explored by contemporary scientists. These physical relics, though fragmented and scattered, act as silent witnesses to a civilization that once harmonized technology, environment, and ethics on a planetary scale. Beyond architecture, certain artifacts hint at advanced technological knowledge that was preserved in symbolic or ritualized forms. Crystals, lenses, and carved stones have been found in multiple regions, often integrated into religious or ceremonial contexts. While mainstream interpretation casts these as purely symbolic, oral traditions and experimental archaeology suggest they may have been functional, capable of focusing light, storing energy, or transmitting information in ways modern science barely begins to replicate. The precision and intent behind their creation indicate a deep understanding of physics and material properties that cannot be explained solely by trial and error, suggesting a legacy of Lemurian scientific mastery that survived in fragmentary form. Many of these artifacts are deliberately hidden or positioned in inaccessible locations, implying that Lemuria's survivors continued to exercise caution even as the civilization itself was dispersed. Caves, subterranean chambers, and mountain temples may have served as repositories for knowledge too dangerous or powerful to be widely disseminated. These hidden sites were preserved not only for protection from misuse, but to maintain continuity across generations, ensuring that fragments of advanced understanding survived the flood's destruction and could be rediscovered when humanity was ready. The mystery surrounding the location and function of these relics adds to the aura of lost science and deliberate ethical oversight associated with Lemuria. Stories of objects imbued with extraordinary properties appear in multiple cultures, often framed in myth as magic or divine instruments. Weapons, tools, or ceremonial devices described as amplifying energy, healing, or influencing natural forces may be echoes of Lemurian technology interpreted symbolically. Across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, legends describe instruments capable of producing effects that defy simple explanation, such as resonating with the earth, controlling water flow, or enhancing human perception. Modern experimental attempts to recreate these effects sometimes succeed in unexpected ways, hinting that the myths may preserve kernels of genuine scientific knowledge, now hidden in narrative form. The strategic distribution of knowledge may also explain why certain ancient civilizations advanced in ways that appeared disconnected geographically. While some regions retained architectural, astronomical, and mathematical principles directly traceable to Lemurian survivors, others inherited ethical frameworks, ceremonial patterns, or symbolic systems that guided development without providing the technical capability to fully replicate the original science. This uneven inheritance created a patchwork of civilizations, each retaining fragments of the sunken empire's wisdom in forms adapted to local circumstances, preserving the underlying principles while transforming their expression. Even modern legends hint at residual influence, tales of hidden cities, underground civilizations, or lost knowledge accessible only to the worthy appear globally, from the Indian subcontinent to Central America. Many of these stories include consistent elements: locations once inhabited by a superior civilization, treasures or knowledge buried to prevent misuse, and warnings about repeating past mistakes. While folklore often dismisses these as imagination, the recurrence and consistency across cultures suggest a shared origin rooted in collective memory of Lemuria, where knowledge was deliberately concealed to prevent catastrophe, yet preserved to guide humanity in the distant future. Scientific anomalies occasionally reinforce the plausibility of Lemurian legacy. Unexplained structures on continental shelves, anomalous geological formations, and archaeological findings that predate recorded history point to human activity in regions long believed uninhabited. Combined with myths and oral traditions describing submersion, advanced tools, and ethical restraint, these anomalies strengthen the argument that Lemuria's influence extended far beyond the land itself, reaching into cultural memory, environmental adaptation, and technological understanding long after physical traces were lost. Even in the modern era, scattered technological remnants echo principles that appear curiously advanced. Ancient water channels, underground reservoirs, and stone alignments show knowledge of hydraulics, resonance, and energy efficiency that could rival contemporary engineering in concept, if not in scale. While many of these remain poorly understood, experimental reconstructions often produce effects that mimic what oral traditions describe: precise movement of water, energy amplification through stone, or spatial arrangements that enhance resonance. These enduring echoes underscore the depth of Lemuria's scientific and ethical sophistication and suggest that its disappearance left humanity with a blueprint partially obscured by myth, but still potent if studied carefully. The persistence of these relics and narratives emphasizes the resilience of Lemuria's legacy. Physical structures may erode, artifacts may be lost, and written records may vanish, but the principles embedded in culture, ritual, and landscape endure, hidden beneath layers of myth, ethics, and symbolic reinterpretation. By examining these traces, modern humanity can glimpse the intellectual, technological, and moral framework of a civilization that was not merely advanced for its time, but fundamentally different in its integration of science, spirituality, and responsibility. The question that remains is not whether Lemuria existed, but how much of its wisdom continues to shape our understanding of the world, even in silence. Secrets still beneath the waves. Even today, the question of Lemuria's lost knowledge continues to intrigue researchers, explorers, and those who study the mysteries of ancient civilization. Unlike Atlantis, which exists primarily in philosophical allegory, Lemuria appears across multiple continents in oral histories, symbolic traditions, and unexplained archaeological patterns, suggesting a civilization whose existence was rooted in shared memory rather than fiction. The very persistence of these narratives raises the question: how much knowledge disappeared when the oceans swallowed its homeland, and how much was preserved, transmitted, or hidden in ways we are only beginning to recognize? Survivors may have scattered deliberately, taking with them the keys to technological and spiritual systems too advanced or too dangerous for untrained societies to handle. Some modern researchers suggest that Lemurian knowledge was encoded in ways that made it resistant to the passage of time, yet invisible without context. Symbols carved into stone, numerical patterns in architecture, and ritualistic practices in ceremonies may have functioned as mnemonic devices, preserving practical techniques through generations. For example, geometric proportions in temples and megaliths correspond to precise mathematical relationships and astronomical cycles that we only now understand. Songs, dances, and chants could carry encoded information about energy flows, seasonal cycles, or navigation, blending artistic expression with practical instruction. In this light, mythology is not merely a narrative form, but a vessel for highly abstracted scientific knowledge. Physical remnants of Lemuria continue to confound scientists and explorers. Continental shelves around the Indian Ocean and submerged plateaus hint at previous landmasses that match descriptions of Lemuria's geography. Advanced hydraulic systems, terracing, and stone arrangements may have been entirely erased by tectonic activity and rising seas, yet scattered islands and underwater formations retain the faintest echoes of human planning. Even anomalies detected through sonar and satellite imagery suggest the existence of structures that could have been used to regulate water, energy, or agriculture on a scale that challenges conventional understanding of prehistoric engineering. Artifacts that defy conventional explanation continue to surface in museums and excavation sites. Crystals arranged in precise geometrical patterns, metallic objects with unusual magnetic properties, and instruments aligned with celestial events hint at a civilization that understood principles of physics, energy, and resonance far earlier than previously assumed. While some researchers dismiss these as coincidence or exaggeration, the repeated global occurrence of such objects, along with consistent myths describing their function, suggests a coherent system of knowledge that was once operational. The scattered nature of these relics mirrors the diaspora of survivors, carrying fragments of Lemurian mastery to distant lands. Lemuria's ethical principles may have influenced how knowledge was handled after the flood. Survivors may have deliberately restricted access to technologies they considered too powerful, dangerous, or disruptive. This would explain why advanced tools and techniques appear sporadically across cultures, often embedded in ritual, mythology, or restricted priestly knowledge. What modern observers interpret as magical or divine may actually be practical technology obscured by ethical limitations designed to prevent misuse, demonstrating a level of foresight and responsibility unparalleled in later civilizations. Even the natural environment may preserve hidden traces of Lemurian influence. Coastal and island formations, oceanic currents, and navigational patterns that Polynesians and other ancient mariners exploited may have been understood originally in terms of energy, resonance, and planetary alignment. By observing the planet itself, Lemurian survivors encoded practical guidance into settlement patterns, myth, and ritual, allowing these principles to endure even after the land itself was submerged. Modern scientists exploring ancient oceanography and geomagnetism sometimes find patterns that echo these ancient insights, hinting at knowledge that predates written history by thousands of years. Some unexplained phenomena in history may also reflect the lingering presence of Lemurian knowledge. Legends of instruments capable of channeling energy, producing light, or enhancing perception may describe technology misinterpreted as supernatural. Ancient texts from India, the Americas, and Polynesia reference tools and techniques that could amplify energy or manipulate matter in ways modern science barely grasps. These accounts, preserved in ritualized language and symbolic imagery, may contain fragments of real applications that functioned in harmony with natural laws, encoded deliberately to survive disasters while remaining protected from casual misuse. The mystery of Lemuria persists because the civilization itself represents both what humanity can achieve and what it can lose. Its disappearance serves as a warning. Knowledge, no matter how advanced, is fragile if not preserved carefully, and even ethical, disciplined societies are vulnerable to planetary forces beyond their control. Yet, the scattered remnants of Lemuria, its symbols, myths, and artifacts, offer tantalizing proof that human civilization can achieve levels of harmony with nature, energy, and ethics that remain unmatched even today. The challenge for modern humanity is not merely to uncover these relics, but to interpret them with the understanding, restraint, and balance that their creators demanded. The legacy of Lemuria endures in the gaps of our knowledge, in unexplained anomalies, and in the myths that persist across continents. It reminds us that human history may contain chapters deliberately hidden beneath water, sediment, and time, waiting for those capable of reading the echoes. Every artifact, every myth, every unexplained alignment may be a surviving note from a civilization that mastered knowledge and responsibility simultaneously, a civilization whose influence, though submerged, continues to ripple through our world, challenging us to recognize that what was lost is perhaps as important as what remains. Modern echoes of a sunken world, even in the present day, traces of Lemuria continue to surface in ways that provoke fascination, debate, and wonder. Researchers exploring the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and other remote regions have documented submerged structures, unusual geological formations, and anomalies in sonar mapping that suggest human activity predating known civilizations. While skeptics attribute these features to natural phenomena, the recurring patterns, grid-like layouts, rectangular foundations, and terraced plateaus hint at a deliberate design that aligns uncannily with ancient descriptions of Lemurian cities. If these structures are indeed remnants of the sunken empire, they serve as tangible proof that a sophisticated, advanced civilization once thrived, leaving behind physical markers that modern science struggles to explain within conventional timelines. The study of artifacts also hints at a continuing influence. Crystals carved with geometric precision, unusual metallic objects, and stone arrangements aligned with celestial bodies are being re-examined with modern tools, including spectroscopy and geophysical imaging. These items, often dismissed in the past as ceremonial or symbolic, reveal a sophistication that aligns with Lemurian principles of energy, resonance, and environmental integration. In some cases, crystal formations appear deliberately tuned to amplify vibrations, potentially functioning as communication devices, energy regulators, or observatories capable of tracking astronomical and environmental cycles. The implications of such discoveries suggest that remnants of Lemurian science may have survived long enough to be integrated into local traditions, encoded in ways that we are only beginning to understand. Legends persist in modern coastal and island communities, echoing memories of a lost civilization beneath the waves. Oral histories of submerged lands, catastrophic floods, and ancestral knowledge passed down through generations often correspond with areas where geological anomalies suggest former landmasses. Fishermen, sailors, and island elders tell stories of land disappearing beneath the sea, of treasures buried to prevent misuse, and of sacred knowledge only accessible to those trained in specific rituals. While these accounts are often dismissed as folklore, their consistency across cultures and continents mirrors the scattered dispersal of Lemurian survivors, suggesting that collective memory can preserve truths over thousands of years, even when the physical evidence is submerged or erased. Modern exploration has uncovered submerged cities that may align with these legends. Off the coasts of India, Indonesia, and Japan, sonar and submersible technology have revealed structures with linear layouts, platforms, and terraces, often situated near tectonically active regions that could have triggered rapid submergence. In some cases, artifacts found in association with these structures suggest ceremonial or functional usage, incorporating geometrical precision and alignment with celestial or tidal cycles. The challenge lies in bridging the gap between observation and interpretation, as conventional archaeology often struggles to accommodate anomalies that do not fit expected timelines or cultural evolution models. Yet the evidence persists, raising the tantalizing possibility that fragments of Lemuria still lie hidden beneath the ocean, waiting to be understood. Even outside of physical structures, the principles of Lemurian technology appear to have left conceptual traces in modern knowledge. Early scientific understanding of magnetism, resonance, and energy storage may echo forgotten applications of Lemurian principles. Ancient texts describing sound, light, and material properties in precise geometric and harmonic terms hint at a theoretical framework remarkably similar to what modern physics now explores. While these ideas were largely interpreted as symbolic or mystical in past centuries, current research sometimes finds surprising correlations between ancient descriptions and reproducible phenomena, suggesting that fragments of a highly advanced energy science were preserved in textual and cultural memory. Certain unexplained artifacts, long the subject of speculation, could also be remnants of Lemurian practice. Precision-cut stones, metal objects that resist corrosion beyond known capabilities, and crystal arrangements aligned with solar or lunar cycles defy conventional archaeological explanation. Experimental reconstructions occasionally reproduce the effects described in myths and oral traditions, from amplified vibrations to energy modulation, hinting at applied knowledge that bridge science and ritual. The recurrence of such artifacts across continents suggests a common origin, likely tied to the dispersal of survivors and their efforts to encode knowledge while protecting it from misuse. The ethical dimension of Lemurian legacy may also echo in modern discovery patterns. Knowledge was likely hidden, obscured, or ritualized to prevent misuse, which may explain why so many ancient artifacts are buried, inaccessible, or encoded symbolically. Temples, caves, and submerged sites often appear deliberately positioned to restrict access, suggesting that Lemurian survivors prioritized long-term preservation over immediate dissemination. This careful stewardship of knowledge may account for the combination of sophisticated technical remnants and extensive mythologization, ensuring that critical principles could survive without falling into the hands of those unprepared to use them responsibly. Modern legends continue to draw on the memory of Lemuria, often conflating myth, oral tradition, and unexplained physical phenomena. Tales of energy amplification, hidden cities, or advanced civilizations beneath the ocean are not confined to a single culture. They appear in Japan, Indonesia, India, the Americas, and Polynesia. These stories often converge on similar themes: the ethical stewardship of knowledge, catastrophic loss, and selective preservation, suggesting that the moral and technological principles of Lemuria have survived in narrative form, echoing across time as both warning and inspiration. In some cases, contemporary researchers and explorers have begun to synthesize these disparate threads, artifacts, legends, sonar mapping, and anomalous alignments into coherent hypotheses about Lemuria's enduring present. While much remains speculative, the convergence of physical, cultural, and mythological evidence points to a civilization whose influence extends beyond its sunken homeland into modern awareness. These echoes, whether subtle or explicit, remind humanity that the story of Lemuria may not be confined to myth, but embedded in landscapes, artifacts, and traditions that continue to challenge conventional timelines and assumptions. The modern echoes of Lemuria compel us to reconsider the nature of human history, knowledge preservation, and civilization itself. They suggest that even when a society disappears physically, its principles, ethics, and understanding can persist in encoded forms through ritual, myth, artifact, and landscape. Every discovery, no matter how fragmentary, offers a glimpse into a civilization that combines science, spirituality, and ethics on a planetary scale. The challenge lies in decoding these remnants responsibly, honoring the balance and foresight that once sustained a world before it was lost to the waves. Lemuria, in this sense, may not be gone. It may continue to whisper across oceans, through stone, and in the stories humanity has carried for millennia. Lessons from a lost civilization. Lemuria's disappearance beneath the waves is more than a historical curiosity. It is a profound lesson in the fragility of civilization and the responsibility that comes with knowledge. Unlike many societies that rise and fall due to war, conquest, or internal collapse, Lemuria's downfall was dictated largely by planetary forces and the limits of adaptation. Yet it was not merely natural catastrophe that sealed its fate. Human choices, even in the most disciplined and advanced societies, are always entwined with environmental realities. The survivors' attempts to preserve knowledge, maintain ethical control, and adapt to changing conditions remind us that wisdom is not simply the accumulation of tools or techniques, but the judicious application of understanding to sustain life and harmony over generations. One of the clearest philosophical lessons is the importance of restraint in the exercise of knowledge. Lemuria's technological and energetic systems were immensely powerful, capable of shaping landscapes, amplifying energy, and altering environments on large scales. Yet, the civilization's leaders deliberately limited access to certain applications, encoded instructions in symbolic form, and entrusted knowledge only to those trained in ethics and responsibility. This balance between capability and moral foresight is a principle that resonates deeply in the modern era, where humanity possesses technological powers from nuclear energy to artificial intelligence that can reshape the world irrevocably. Lemuria demonstrates that the possession of knowledge is inseparable from the imperative to wield it responsibly. Another lesson lies in the integration of human society with the natural world. Lemurian cities, energy systems, and social structures were built to harmonize with the planet's rhythms rather than dominate them. Water, wind, magnetic fields, and solar cycles were considered partners in civilization, not resources to be exploited. Their collapse reminds us that human advancement cannot be divorced from environmental awareness. The degradation or mismanagement of natural systems, even in societies possessing advanced technology, creates vulnerabilities that no level of sophistication can fully mitigate. Modern civilizations face similar challenges, from climate change to ecosystem collapse, emphasizing the timelessness of Lemuria's philosophy of balance. Ethics were embedded into Lemurian knowledge itself, a principle that modern society often separates from technical progress. Engineering, energy management, and social organization were guided not only by functionality, but by consideration of long-term consequences. Misuse or imbalance was understood to have cascading effects on both community and environment. Modern societies, with their compartmentalized approach to technology, ethics, and governance, may find themselves vulnerable precisely because they ignore the integrated model exemplified by Lemuria. The civilization story suggests that ethical awareness cannot be an afterthought. It must be coded into the structure of knowledge itself, shaping decisions at every level. Lemuria also demonstrates the fragility of even the most advanced societies in the face of sudden planetary upheaval. No amount of moral or technological sophistication could prevent the physical destruction wrought by tectonic instability and rising seas. Yet the civilization's emphasis on knowledge preservation, ritualized ethics, and careful dissemination allowed fragments of its wisdom to survive. Humanity today faces analogous challenges. Global risks such as climate disruption, asteroid impacts, and nuclear proliferation remind us that survival depends on foresight, preparation, and the ethical application of knowledge to safeguard the collective future. The echo of Lemuria in modern myth and anomaly serves as a warning and a guide. The diaspora of Lemurian survivors underscores the importance of adaptability and knowledge transfer. By integrating their teachings into emerging civilizations, survivors ensured that critical principles, astronomy, mathematics, ethics, and energy management were not lost entirely. This lesson emphasizes that knowledge cannot be hoarded or isolated. It must be transmitted thoughtfully, adapted to changing circumstances, and encoded in forms resilient to time and upheaval. Modern society's archives, digital data, and educational systems reflect similar concerns. The continuity of human understanding relies on both preservation and ethical stewardship, a principle Lemuria exemplified thousands of years ago. The civilization also illustrates the danger of interpreting knowledge divorced from context. Many post-flood societies inherited Lemurian technology and wisdom in fragmented form, resulting in applications that were powerful yet misunderstood. Rituals, monuments, and symbolic systems often preserved function without clarity, leading later civilizations to mythologize or misapply what they inherited. Modern parallels are evident. Advanced scientific discoveries, when applied without comprehensive understanding, can produce unintended consequences. Lemuria teaches that knowledge divorced from holistic comprehension and ethical framing may persist, but it is vulnerable to misuse or misinterpretation. Cultural memory, myth, and oral tradition emerge as essential tools for preserving wisdom when physical infrastructure fails. Lemuria's influence survives not only in submerged cities or scattered artifacts, but in the stories, festivals, and symbols that encode principles of balance, ethics, and survival. Modern societies, with global communication networks and technological archives, may underestimate the value of cultural frameworks in transmitting wisdom across generations. Lemuria reminds us that preservation is not merely a matter of storage, it is the careful embedding of meaning into human experience, ensuring that essential lessons survive even catastrophic loss. The story of Lemuria challenges humanity to consider the long-term consequences of progress. A civilization can be brilliant, ethical, and highly advanced, yet still fail if it underestimates the forces of the natural world or the fragility of infrastructure. The civilization's careful integration of ethics, science, and spirituality provides a model for sustainable progress, where advancement is measured not in power or speed, but in harmony, foresight, and preservation. For modern humanity, the lessons of Lemuria are as relevant as ever. Knowledge must be wielded responsibly, environmental balance must be maintained, and the consequences of technological ambition must be anticipated over generations rather than decades. The legacy of Lemuria endures in myths, submerged ruins, anomalies, and scattered knowledge, but its greatest lesson is philosophical, that the survival of civilization depends on more than tools and infrastructure. It depends on wisdom, restraint, and a holistic understanding of our place within the natural order. Humanity may still rediscover fragments of its lost principles, hidden in ritual, artifact, or tradition, but the challenge lies in interpreting them with the foresight, responsibility, and ethical clarity that the original civilization embodied. Lemuria's story is a caution, a guide, and a testament to the potential of a civilization that harmonized power, knowledge, and morality on a planetary scale, offering timeless lessons for those willing to listen, patterns across time and space. One of the most compelling aspects of Lemuria's legacy is how it manifests across cultures that are otherwise separated by thousands of miles and countless years. Myths from India, the Pacific Islands, South America, and even parts of Africa describe a lost homeland, great floods, and survivors who carried essential knowledge into emerging civilizations. While skeptics often dismiss these similarities as coincidental, the recurrence of nearly identical motifs, including sunken lands, ethical dilemmas regarding knowledge, and divine or semi-divine teachers, suggests a shared origin rooted in historical memory rather than imaginative storytelling. These global patterns imply that Lemuria was not a singular, localized phenomenon, but a civilization whose influence radiated across continents through survivors, cultural transmission, and encoded wisdom embedded in myth and ritual. In South America, the sudden emergence of civilizations such as the Incas and pre-Incan societies shows striking parallels to Lemurian principles. Architectural precision, terraced agriculture, and water management techniques suggest inherited knowledge rather than gradual innovation. The construction of structures like Machu Picchu and the ceremonial centers in Cuzco demonstrates alignment with celestial events, energy flows, and geomantic principles remarkably similar to descriptions attributed to Lemurian cities. This alignment suggests that knowledge was transmitted through cultural memory and oral tradition, enabling subsequent civilizations to reconstruct the principles without fully understanding the original context. Symbols, patterns, and rituals preserved both practical and ethical lessons, guiding society while masking the deeper technological sophistication that had been lost beneath the waves. Across the Pacific, Polynesian myths of ancestral islands swallowed by the ocean reinforce the global reach of Lemurian memory. Navigation techniques that allowed Polynesians to traverse thousands of miles with extraordinary precision may have originated from Lemurian knowledge of ocean currents, stellar patterns, and planetary energy flows. Unlike isolated invention, these practices appear to reflect a coherent methodology preserved through oral tradition, cultural practice, and ritualized observation of the natural world. Their survival suggests a deliberate effort by Lemurian survivors to ensure that practical knowledge persisted even if stripped of full technological context, transmitting both functional skills and an ethical approach to the natural environment. In India, legends of Kumari Kandam and the survivors of great floods echo a similar structure, Ancient texts describe sages who emerged from submerged lands with wisdom about astronomy, mathematics, and spiritual ethics. Temples, underground chambers, and astronomical observatories built in the subcontinent display advanced alignment with celestial phenomena, and the integration of knowledge into religious ritual reflects a continuity of Lemurian ethical frameworks. The recurrence of similar flood narratives and moral imperatives across multiple cultures strengthens the argument that these are not mere coincidence, but reflections of a global event filtered through cultural memory, encoded as both myth and instruction. Even in regions far removed from the Indian Ocean or Pacific, traces of these patterns appear. African myths about lost civilizations and great deluges, Middle Eastern accounts of flood survivors preserving knowledge, and European tales of ancient sunken cities reveal recurring themes: advanced technology, ethical restraint, catastrophic loss, and selective preservation of wisdom. While local cultures interpreted these themes differently, the consistency of motifs, including ethical responsibility, energy awareness, and planetary attunement, suggests the diffusion of Lemurian principles rather than independent invention. Each civilization interpreted the fragments through its own cosmology, producing myths and rituals that preserve the ethical and technological essence of the lost empire. Material culture also supports this global pattern. Artifacts, megalithic structures, and symbolic carvings appear on multiple continents with similar geometric precision, astronomical alignment, and resonant construction. From stone circles in Europe to ceremonial platforms in Asia and South America, recurring design principles imply that the survivors of Lemuria disseminated knowledge through practical demonstration and encoded ritual, ensuring continuity without revealing full technical detail. These remnants demonstrate that Lemuria's influence was not purely spiritual or mythological, but embedded in tangible objects and landscapes, serving as enduring markers of advanced civilization. Even legends of divine or semi-divine teachers reflect a consistent narrative strategy for knowledge preservation. Across cultures, these figures are depicted as guiding humanity, imparting wisdom, and imposing ethical constraints on the use of powerful tools. This motif mirrors the principles observed in Lemurian society, where ethical mastery and technological prowess were inseparable, and knowledge was deliberately restricted to prevent misuse. By embedding these lessons in myth and ritual, Lemuria's influence persisted even in cultures that had no direct contact with the original civilization, shaping social norms, governance, and spiritual practice across the globe. The convergence of these patterns offers profound implications for understanding human history. Rather than isolated bursts of innovation, advanced knowledge appears to have spread through migration, cultural adaptation, and ethical transmission. Lemuria's collapse did not erase its impact. It redistributed it, scattering principles, technologies, and moral frameworks across continents. The global recurrence of myths, symbolic patterns, and advanced construction suggests that civilization did not arise independently in isolated pockets, but that human development was influenced by fragments of a singular, advanced culture whose memory survived cataclysm and time. The study of these patterns challenges the conventional linear narrative of human progress. Civilization, technology, and ethics are revealed not as sequential achievements, but as fragments of an inherited, complex system whose foundation may predate the earliest recorded history. The echoes of Lemuria persist not only in myth and legend, but in physical structures, cultural practices, and unexplained artifacts, offering humanity a glimpse of what was once possible. Recognizing these patterns allows for a re-evaluation of human potential, ethical responsibility, and the continuity of knowledge, suggesting that even in the face of catastrophic loss, wisdom can survive through cultural memory, encoded practice, and ethical stewardship across generations.